what we're showing. Nice. All right, so we did a little bit of introduction, and this was actually one of our first groups back in 2016 when we started our tours. So my objective tonight is, oops, go back, is education, the ability to better understand what the headlines about Cuba mean, right? So every time something happens in Cuba, a lot of times we read the headline and nothing else. And so want to give you just better understanding there, and acknowledge that diverse perspectives are okay, and have fact-based discussion. And I'm going to do my best not to let my political biases influence what I say or my attitude. Although Cynthia said, just let it out when we were bird watching this morning. And then the key to know is that our tours to Cuba are continuing.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
No worries at all. Sue, we see you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
I can see now. I just had to go like when you're going through pictures, scroll across.
Yeah, good. And this picture is my mom and I in Havana doing a tour in a classic Chevy. So I'm going to go through a brief timeline of what has been happening with Cuba in the last 10 years, because there have been so many changes. And so we'll start with 2015. So 2015 was when President Obama announced the reestablishment of diplomatic relations, and activities started happening. He made his first trip to Cuba, and it was not only was it exciting for Cubans to have a current sitting president come to Cuba and say we're going to normalize relations, but on another level that I didn't often read about in US media, it was exciting for Cubans who are Afro-Cuban, African descent, to have a Black man standing there as president of one of the most powerful countries in the world, and which is super important in Cuba, which is very ethnically diverse. So it was a special time in history in Cuba. And then that high continued. So when we started our tours to Cuba, there were not commercial flights into Cuba from the US. So we had to fly from the US, we would fly to Miami and then take a charter flight into Havana. And that flight was $800 per person for that 1 hour flight. And so when President Obama allowed commercial flights to start, it was very exciting. So we continue today, even we fly American, United, and Southwest into Cuba. Frontier sometimes not. It depends on how much demand there is. And then that was when cruise ships started going to Cuba. So a lot of times I'll meet people who say, yeah, I went to Cuba on a cruise, and I know exactly when they went. This stage did not last very long. And in Cuba, I mean, as we were doing our tours, we were starting to say, wow, these huge ships are coming into port, and Old Town, the beautiful historic Old Town of Cuba, is flooded with people. And so maybe we need to set our days that we see the Old Town of Havana when there are not cruise ships there, because there's so many tourists. Can't get great pictures of these places when you're fighting the crowd. And the cruise ships went to a few different ports around the country. And then it all came to a quick halt in 2017. And so when Trump became president, he put restrictions on travel, and he got rid of one of the visa categories that a lot of people traveled under that was kind of loosey-goosey, and he created support for the Cuban people. And what was ironic was when he created this, I looked at the description of it, and then I looked at how we set up our tours, and they were already perfectly in line. So I think President Trump may have read my business plan, because the intention, I mean, don't you believe it? The intention is to help, of our business, is to help small businesses in Cuba thrive, right? Help people be able to provide for their family and divert money away from the Cuban government. So another one of the restrictions around remittances is one of the, a very big income in Cuba, and that is sending money to your family in Cuba. And so a lot of Cubans, just like they come from other places in Latin America, come to the US, work hard, send money to help their family at home, because it's harder to earn money there. So he put restrictions on it, making it very difficult for Cubans in the US to send money to their family. And then in 2019, he ended cruise ships coming into, this is the harbor in Havana, coming into the harbor, and he banned flights outside of Havana. So currently, I mean, and okay, so before he banned this, there were flights that would go from Miami to Havana, Miami to Camagüey, Miami to Santiago de Cuba. Those are the three kind of biggest cities, biggest airports. And so it was easy to get to different parts of the island. And if you haven't been to Cuba, Cuba's like the size of Kentucky. So think about when you go to Puerto Rico, you can drive across the island, easily in a day. And Cuba is mountainous, but also much, much bigger, the largest of the Caribbean islands. So when you ban flights to Camagüey, which is halfway down the island, or to Santiago de Cuba from Miami, it's really hard to get to that part of the island. It kind of shuts them off from tourism, unless the tourists fly in from another destination like Mexico. So then in 2020, we hit COVID, and the island really shut down. And so much so, like here we say, oh yeah, things shut down. We stayed home for a while. My kids, I had 2 high schoolers and 1 in college, and Rachel was the one in college. She came home from Boston and did the next year at home online. And, my high schoolers finished out the school year online. But in Cuba, the island, because they are able to protect their borders being an island, they really shut things down to keep COVID out of the country. They even shut down the airport in Havana for a period of time. So it was really startling to watch, because they were doing a lot to protect their people, and of course had a lot of rules around masks and such. But they were, by shutting down a lot of things coming in, it shut down a lot of supplies. So medical supplies, food, things like that. And then they also limited movement around the country. And so things that were grown on the far east side of the island weren't making it to Havana, which is 2 million of the 11 million people in Cuba. So that economic impact was incredible, and Cuba is still working its way back from the economic impact. In Cuba, they were one of the first countries to develop vaccines for COVID, and everybody essentially gets vaccinated in Cuba for COVID, every Cuban. And so there's no longer impacts of contagious illness. It's the impact on the economy that they're experiencing now. So 2021, Biden makes slow changes, and he he's starting to open things up. He allows flights to now go back to going to those 3 cities. The 4th one is Varadero, which is the place that's famous for snorkeling and scuba diving. And so flights have returned to those main cities from Miami, which is phenomenal. But one of the key things that we had hoped he would do is to take Cuba off of the state-sponsored terrorist list, and which was something that Trump put Cuba on that list, meaning there's a lot more restrictions around the country. And I thought right away that Biden would take it off of that list. But then there were protests that July in Cuba because of the economy. And it slowed Biden down from making those changes. So Cuba continues to be on this terrorist list. So one of the great things that he did, though, was in 2022 and 23, he lifted the cap on remittances. So instead of being only able to send a small amount of money to your family in Cuba to help them, you were able to send as much as you wanted to your family in Cuba. And that it makes a big difference. Deborah will probably notice when we go to Cuba in next week that I will have an extra suitcase full of things for my friends that are Cubans, but also for family members of my friends, right? So for example, I have a friend who lives here in Boulder, Colorado, and she has cousins that live in Cienfuegos. And so every time I'm going on a trip that goes across the island, like the one we're doing with SVP, then I take items to her family. And she gave me 2 full grocery bags of things to take to her family, plus an envelope of cash, right? So that Western Union, none of those are making money off of her getting money to her family. And she said, "Is it all right that I'm sending a lot of money with you?" And I asked her how much it was. And then I kind of laughed out loud because it was such a small amount compared to what we consider a lot of money as Americans. So it was cheaper than my flight, to give you perspective. So it's really important to be able to, for Cubans and Cuban Americans that live here, to be able to help their families. So that kind of gives you the timeline, but here's the big impact. Tourism dropped by 50% in the last 6 years. That is a huge part of their economy and has made it really hard for Cubans. So the current situation in Cuba is that about 10% of the island's population, mostly the adults between 20 and 50, have left the island in the last 3 years. So U.S. government estimates are over 1 million people have come to the U.S. from Cuba. And that's a lot of people. But what's really interesting is that I don't know a ton of Cubans, right? I probably know less than 50 Cubans by face and name after going to Cuba 14 times. So they're the people that are bus drivers that run the casas that we love to stay at, that work at our favorite restaurants, things like that. I know those people. And many of them have left. So it's been startling to me. I can't imagine what it's like for Cubans who are on the island to every day wake up and find out who has left. And ironically, 3 of our bus drivers have all left. And the time we get a new great bus driver for the next tour, he's gone, and Roger, our guide, has to find somebody else. So it's having a huge impact on this country that already has an aging demographic of adults. And then the other thing that we hear a lot about is the power grid and the power failures. And I don't know if you heard today, but today the news was talking about Puerto Rico having had a blackout. So the power grid in Cuba is impacted by aging technology. That's what we hear about. A lack of fuel, which is exacerbated because one of the restrictions that President Trump put on Cuba last time was to blockade against a lot of the oil carriers that were going from Venezuela into Cuba to put pressure on both countries. And that hasn't truly been lifted since Trump did that. But another thing that's impacting that I'm observing when I go to Cuba, but I'm not reading about in the media, is the impact of EV motorcycles and air conditioners. So EV motorcycles didn't exist there before 2020. And now in Havana, they are zipping all over the place and they're silent, right? They're very fuel efficient. But the bummer is, and it's the government that's importing a lot of them. The bummer is that the power grid wasn't ramped up. So we've traded out oil for electricity, but the electricity relies on oil. They have, I think I read that 5% of the electrical grid in Cuba is solar. And that's something that they're working very closely with Chinese manufacturers to increase quickly. And then air conditioners. So when you fly to Cuba, you will see a lot of Cubans are bringing big boxes of things on the flight that they paid extra for. They're standing in line at the customs gate, getting into Havana, and a lot of them have air conditioning units for their family members, which, phenomenal. But also air conditioning units, a lot of times, tend to suck a lot of energy. So those are two reasons why the power grid is impacted. Now, for people who are going on our trips this coming year, not to worry. So I was in Havana in November with two of our tours, and there were parts of the city that were darker than other parts of the city because they do rolling blackouts, but they're not blacked out, right? So here in Colorado, when we have a blackout, right? If our neighborhood has a blackout or a good portion of our county has a blackout, there's no power anywhere. Whereas in Cuba, they're accustomed to rolling blackouts. So a lot of people have generators. The Cuban government distributes small amounts of power to things so the airports never shut down. Emergency services never shut down when there are blackouts in Cuba. So all the casas that we stay at, they all have generators, and they're able to keep things going. This is normal life for them. Whereas in my house, we would be using our flashlights and cell phones until they run out of power and using candles. We don't have any source of energy in my house outside of electricity. So.
Is it boring?
Okay. Marco Rubio. So this is one of the things that will make it different when President Trump becomes a president in January than last time, is that Marco Rubio was in the Senate last time, and now it looks like he will become the Secretary of State. And so I did some studying on Marco Rubio's agenda with Cuba. And he is the son of Cuban immigrants. So his parents immigrated to the US in 1956. So they actually came right before the revolution, before Fidel took over the country, which tells you even though they worked blue collar jobs, but people who came in the 50s and 60s from Cuba were generally people who were very well-to-do, well-educated, and well-connected. And so he grew up with this family, And in Miami, the overwhelming consensus is that Miami Cubans hate Cuba because of the hardship that they lived under in their home country. And so one of the things that he has said that he wants to do is go back to restricting remittances. So having tight controls on what people can send to their family in Cuba, and then also restricting even more the oil shipments to Cuba, particularly sent from Venezuela. So critics say about this is that these measures often hurt ordinary Cubans more than the government, and that engagement rather than isolation may be a more effective approach to fostering change, right? So that's what we saw President Obama doing, was this, his key thing was engaging with Cuba rather than isolating.
Yeah.
So the impacts on our tours. So I expect that as President Trump makes changes to travel to Cuba, our visa status will remain because it's the one that he created, and it is support for the Cuban people. And so to comply with that, we stay in bed and breakfasts, we eat in privately owned restaurants, we do everything we can to employ local Cubans rather than pay the government for a service, which is tricky in a socialist communist country. And then I expect our flights to and from cities aside from Havana will end like they did before. And I think it'll happen sometime in the next 12 months. Honestly, I think that when Trump, it's different, the world is different than 4 years ago. And there are a lot of things that will be pulling at our president, and Cuba is not going to be the top priority. So I think it'll be sometime later in 2025 that he will eliminate flights aside from Havana. And so if he removes the flights from Camagüey, then that will impact our tours, the music, dance, and art tours, and our Hershey tour. Not to say that you'll be stuck, but it just means that we will change the itinerary so that you don't get to go to Camagüey, which is super unfortunate because the art in Camagüey is spectacular. The art culture and the ballet culture there. But it also saves you from doing an 8-hour bus ride back to Havana to fly home. And when this happened before, the airlines were super accommodating in terms of rebooking people on other flights. But I really don't think anything will happen till the summertime. So not to panic if you're headed to Cuba this spring. And then one of the things that we are doing to adapt is that our tours coming up that we'll be selling for next winter have more emphasis on bird watching and nature-focused itineraries rather than the touristy events, because the touristy events will be lagging, such as shows and live music, a lot of things you can do at night in the big cities in Havana. Those things I expect will continue to decrease accessibility. So we're focusing more on what Cuba has to offer that doesn't require Cubans to have a lot of money. Okay, so there's some positives here. Even if the president makes it more difficult for people to go to Cuba, this reduction in tourism can help maintain the authenticity of Cuban culture. So travelers will get to experience local traditions, art, and history without mega commercialization. And I have an example for you. When we started going to Cuba, the only soda you could buy, the brand was called Tucola, and it's Tukola. And that was the soda brand manufactured by the Cuban government. And then when Obama loosened the restrictions, suddenly you could get Diet Pepsi at places around the island. It was just like, wait, what? Supposedly our embargo doesn't allow for this, but there's a loophole somewhere that Pepsi and Coca-Cola found and got into. So they're still available in Cuba, but not everywhere. So sometimes you'll go to a restaurant and they'll say, oh, the only soda we have is Coca-Cola. And then the next day you'll go to a restaurant and they'll say, we don't have Coke or Pepsi, but we have Tucola. So I have really seen this kind of like authentically Cuban things get a little bit watered down with our commercialism. And then there is protecting natural landscapes. So with less people going into Cuba, ecosystems like Cuba's diverse wildlife, coral reefs, and forests will better thrive in their natural habitats. You have less people diving, you have less industry happening that is removing trees, less people hiking in Trinidad, things like that. Then the birds, flowers, and bugs are going to thrive. And snakes. I won't talk about snakes. But I did a snake tour several years ago in Cuba, and it was phenomenal. The key is if you want to see snakes, you have to go in July and you have to go out at night. So if you're on a tour that doesn't go in July and doesn't go at night, I'm sorry, I don't think you'll see a snake. And none of our tours this year go in July. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute and then we'll come back to this. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. I kind of talked a lot. So what questions came up for you, or contradictions, whatever you read that's different than what I shared?
Well, first of all, thank you. That was very helpful, giving us the timeline, the history, and it gives us an idea what to expect under the new president. I'm interested in knowing how many people on this call are going to be on the April 1 to April 10 trip. Anyone besides me and Glenda?
You've got Sandy,
Okay.
Evan, and Avis, Marcia. Yeah.
Okay. And the other is you had mentioned in a prior meeting that it's best to wait until when to buy the tickets?
January.
Airline.
Yeah. So this month I'll send you recommendations.
Okay.
I've been watching, so I watch as you can imagine, I watch the prices on flights closely into Cuba. And just, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? I think it was 2 weeks ago, the prices for the end of March dropped. They went from over $900 down to $700. And so it's one of those things that if you jump in there super early, either you might get your flights might get canceled, Southwest to some people going in February, or the flights will be priced too high. So yeah, I'll send you recommendations.
Okay.
This month. Yeah.
Hey, Jenny, from the chat, Troy is wondering if you can describe the typical private housing accommodations, and if you anticipate any restrictions or changes in accommodations.
I'll share a little bit, but then I would love if Sue or Jeannie want to share, because you've both been to Cuba in the last year. But so we do not expect any changes in our lodging. The only thing that would change is if, for example, one of my favorite places to stay in Varadero is this couple where the man is an Italian chef. So he makes this extravagant breakfast, and he and his wife are considering moving back to Italy because the tourism in Varadero has dropped so much that it's harder for them. And so those things, but we're not seeing many of our casas closed down because of that. Sue or Jeannie, would you like to share what it was like to stay in the bed and breakfast in Cuba?
I will.
Yeah, I will too. Go ahead.
Okay. They were all great. Very comfortable, easy to get to, and yeah, everything about them was great.
Okay, the people were especially accommodating, and they had to be, because sometimes they were dealing with blackouts and firing up their own generator and that sort of thing. So it wasn't always easy for them, but they were very accommodating to us. Everything was clean, everything was comfortable. You do have more second stories there when, you know, where you might have to walk upstairs to get to your room.
Yeah.
The decor is wonderful. They have great art from all different eras on the walls.
Yeah. Rachel, would you put in the chat the link to the gallery on our website so you can see some photos of some of the rooms, the places that we stay? And then also on the homepage of our website, we have a 3-minute video that shows you what it's like to be on a tour, on one of our tours in Cuba. And you'll see the casas. But as Sue mentioned, the second story, I mean, there's always people there to carry your bags for you, but it's also another nice reason to pack as much as you can in a carry-on. Pack light for Cuba, because you don't need big, heavy winter coats. So it's very doable. I always pack 5 days worth of clothes, wash it halfway through, and then I'm set for the next 5 days. What other questions?
I want to just ask one thing. Are you going to do the Havana Jazz Fest again, do you think? In the
Yes.
future? Because you said some events may not happen, but that still will.
Yeah, that one is a high priority for tourism, and so yeah, we have it posted for January 2026 is the Havana Jazz Festival, and we go 3 nights. We go to see different performances, but also in the afternoon, and it's just really, we had so much fun on that trip. Maybe Jeannie and I had more fun than anybody, but we had so much fun.
Hey, Jenny, I had a quick question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, by the way. One of our big ideas of going to Cuba, or one of our purposes, was to really help with the tourism aspect and contribute to the tourism side of the economy. But how do you kind of balance that when the country's struggling as it is to what we take away as tourists, like our impact on resources and short labor situations, or, you know, other kind of difficulties that the Cuban people are having? When does it cross a threshold that we're not actually helping, but we're hurting?
Maybe we were close to the threshold when we had cruise ships going into Cuba. But right now, the people are saying, thank you so much for coming to Cuba. Like, it's an important piece. The other thing that I think is hard, it's hard for us to understand as US Americans, because everybody in the US, everybody has access to everything if you have money to pay for it. In Cuba, although I would say, trying to come up with a good example, there are things that perhaps, okay, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but perhaps if you work in the medical profession, say that I have a friend who is, he's a very specialized doctor. He has access to wholesale medical products that I don't have access to, right? I have to get them at a different store. In Cuba, if you work in tourism, if you run a bed and breakfast, a privately owned restaurant, you have access to those wholesale type of things that not all Cubans have access to. So, yeah. And the other thing I think to note is that when I was in Cuba in November, I speak Spanish. I'm talking to Cubans on the street. And one of the things that's frustrating for Cubans right now is that they went through this in the 90s of the economy really falling apart when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so those people who were teenagers in the 90s are now in their 50s, 40s, and 50s. And they're saying, how can this be happening to our country again? Right? We had so much hope when tourism started flooding in, our economy was growing. So yeah. So right now, the people I'm talking to, they're just so grateful that we're coming and we're seeing their country. We're bringing the message back to the US of here's what's really happening in Cuba. More than anything, a lot of our travelers come back and they understand why it's so important for us to normalize relations with Cuba rather than to try to freeze out the communist government. And yeah, Cubans are just grateful that we're coming. So David, you're not eating somebody else's bread. Do not worry. I live with the same kind of thought process. That's why I always ask a lot of questions about it, because I don't want to be taking things away from people. I just want to add, right, when we go.
Jenny, chiming in from the chat, Troy wants to know, with the new US government in place, do you think there will be any new animosity towards US tourists visiting Cuba?
I only heard half of that.
It's in the chat.
Yeah.
To tag on to David's question, Troy is wondering, with the new US government in place, do you think there will be any new animosity towards US tourists visiting Cuba?
Oh, no. Which is super interesting, right? Because it's a very reasonable question, Troy. But that is that the first time I went to Cuba, like, it was intimidating because I've lived all over Central America, but I'd never been in such a communist place, never a place, these pictures that they paint for us in the media and like Cold War and all of those things. And so we're traveling in a group. I'm talking to Cubans in the park and they're saying, oh, are you guys from Canada? And I was like, well, actually, we're from the US. And he was like, wow, really? That's so great. Hey, they're from the US. And people were super excited. So Cubans understand that these games that are happening are between their government and our government, not the people and the people. So we've never experienced any animosity. And even when I talk to, I kind of talk to people in Cuba, if you hadn't figured that out. And I'll talk to people who are in military or police, if they'll have a conversation with me. And they're more like, they're quick to say, how can we help you? What can we do to make this better for you in Cuba? Rather than to say, why are you in our country? Yeah, it's good.
Jenny, did Lee and Fred Carpenter contact you to send some money to their friend William, the artist in Trinidad?
No, but I did respond to that email. So I bet they're just waiting till after the new year and I'll hear from them this week.
Okay.
Yeah. What else?
So for the November 2025 tour, so the arts, and I'm very interested in the birding piece, of course, but also very much in the arts and culture and history, as my own background is in the arts. So what I heard you say was that the arts and cultural components of the trip might be more localized and less big, more commercialized kinds of things, or big museum tours or that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So instead of being able to go see a big show, at the Hotel Nacional, the show might be closed down but we go find local places for music, things like that.
Okay, okay,
But yeah,
okay.
you're still gonna see art. It's kind of like, I tell people going on the art and music tours, you're still gonna see a bird, whether you want to or not, right? And I tell people going on the bird watching tour, well, you're still gonna see art and culture because
Yeah.
it's all together. It's just
Right.
not
Okay, good.
the emphasis. Yeah,
Great. Thank you.
sure.
Hey, Jenny, I was talking to Ellen, who's on our trip next week, and she was
Yeah.
saying, and you had said before that just carry $1 bills, don't carry anything bigger. Is that, did I hear you right? Or,
No.
okay, good. I can't carry a
Yeah.
lot of that much.
Yeah, no, food prices have actually soared quite a bit in the last 4 years in Cuba. So you're not going to get much for $1. But probably what she intended to say was bring dollars to Cuba, right? So credit cards don't work in Cuba because US banks cannot do financial transactions with Cuba. And so on the packing list that I give you before you go on the trip, I give you a recommended amount of money to bring. And I like to bring, generally on a 10-day trip, I bring $500 of spending money, and it's way more than I need. But that's enough to cover the meals if there are meals that are not included. And so I bring $200 bills. I bring the rest of it in 20s, 10s, and 5s. And then just change a little bit as I go. I do like to bring a stack of ones to leave as tips. When you check out of the casa for the housekeeper, things like that.
And did you say something about the bills need to be crisp? They don't want any damaged bills?
Yeah,
Okay.
which has really been my experience all over Latin America.
No, just get
When you
out
bring cash.
them with M&T. Yeah.
Yeah. I go to First Bank here in Colorado, and I walk in and they say, "Oh, are you about to take another trip?" But now I have a banker. I email her and say, "Hey, I'm coming in for crisp, clean bills." And she has them set aside for me when I come in the next day. But I also, I bring in more than $500. If it's a tour where I need to make some of the payments as we go for casas and such. So, but yeah, you don't want bills that have rips or marks on them because they often won't exchange them for you.
Good.
Okay, so everybody who is going on a trip this year or in the future with us, we do a trip orientation 2 to 4 weeks before your trip, just for your group of people that are going. And so that's a great time to to ask all those detailed questions. If we get off the call tonight and you're like, but wait, what do I do about, should I pack a flashlight or just bring my phone and use it as a flashlight? Things like that. We talk about that at the trip orientation. So, yeah.
Hi, Jenny.
Good.
Judy, how are you?
Judy, hi, Judy.
Hi, I'll turn on my video. Hi, thank you so much for tonight. So I was just curious, I haven't officially been on one of your trips, but I've been on many. So when you bring your suitcase for your friend, do you also ask people coming on the trip to bring some things in terms of like over-the-counter medicine, or I haven't seen the list. So I was just curious, do you bring some things like that also, or suggest that people do?
Yeah. And this year it is really what people have been asking us to, because I always say, what would you like us to bring? Right? Because it's very feels very paternalistic to say, you as Cubans must need these items. Right? So I ask Cubans, what should we bring? I ask Roger, what are people wanting, don't have access to? And So it's right now, this year, it has been things like Tylenol, aspirin, ibuprofen in their original bottles, right? So there's that. And then something that people often ask for is Colgate brand toothpaste, because the Cuban brand toothpaste is not very high quality, and people know about Colgate. They like Colgate. Those are some of the big things that people are asking for. Thanks for reminding me, Judy. Yeah. And I would say, you know, bring a few things, right? I walk into Walmart and say, how can I bring this whole store to my friends in the country? So you have to be able to set some limits. And I always say, bring 5 to 7 things, because you're going to stay in about 4 or 5 different casas. And it's on your packing list.
Yeah.
Super. All right. Well, I hope that you felt like you got some good information tonight.
Yeah.
I hope that you feel confident that even as we get a new president in and you see Marco Rubio and you hear the words Cuba, that it's not going to sabotage your opportunity. We continue to adapt and adjust as a company to make things just wonderful for you all and wonderful for the Cubans that we get to meet as we travel along too. So your tourism really is helping out Cubans and helping those Cuban families be able to stay on the island.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.